Hi, this is Ted, and for the next hour, you'll be listening to a reading of articles and features from the Monday, July, whatever that was, 27th edition of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And you can tell that I'm a little discombobulated. We've been traveling and just got back, but I did want to get this reading done. And so we'll start with a guest essay called You Aren't Going to Like What Comes After America. This is by Chrystia Freeland, who is a former Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Minister of Finance of Canada. Blaming Canada used to be such a fantastical idea that it was a joke. A couple of decades ago, South Park imagined a campaign against Canada for fabricated offenses, in this case children who swear, as a satirical device whose obvious impossibility was meant to underscore the pathetic human tendency to point fingers at someone, anyone else, for our failings. And yet, here we are, with the actual President of the United States well into his second term, blaming Canada for pretty much everything. The South Park movie culminates in a war between Canada and the United States. For now, in the real world, the battlefield is economic, with Trump threatening to impose tariffs on some $20 billion of Canadian exports, ranging from hockey sticks to cement. The official pretext is unfair Canadian treatment of U.S. booze, dairy, and cars. That's just the most recent rationale. Earlier in July, Canada's cited crime was being ravaged by the dangerous fires in our own boreal forest. Before that, Canada was considered a national security threat and therefore subject to tariffs on our steel, aluminum, car parts, and cars. What makes this new attack on Canada truly absurd is that it runs counter to the United States' own economic interests. American workers can, with some justification, complain about China's self aggrandizing trade policies. And it's true that the downward pressure on wages in competing countries could lower labor and environmental standards. But America's trade relationship with its northern neighbor is very strong and mutually beneficial. The Trump White House knows that because commerce between the two countries is governed by a trade agreement negotiated during the first Trump administration and lauded by the president himself as the best trade deal ever. Even politicians who were lifelong critics of free trade and opponents of Trump's backed the United States Mexico-Canada agreement. In fact, that agreement was the first and only trade deal Sherrod Brown, the trade skeptic and former senator from Ohio, who is now running again, ever supported. Mr. Brown was right to do so. The United States runs a slight trade deficit with Canada in overall trade in goods and services, and a large surplus if you exclude energy, which America needs more, not less of, in the power-hungry age of artificial intelligence. At a time when Americans rank inflation and affordability as their top economic concerns, adding another tax on consumer goods, which is what tariffs are, is self-defeating. Rehearsing the economic irrationality of the president's trade war on Canada is fun and a self-soothing behavior for America's long-suffering northern friends. But the reality is that the economics of Trump's tariff attacks on Canada are not really the point. This fight isn't about correcting the global financial imbalances that the president's more high-minded apologists contend are the true purpose of his trade policy. Nor is it about ending the Rust Belt deaths of despair that Mr. Trump's most articulate enablers sometimes cite as the motivation for their protectionism. That doesn't mean that there is no method to what can look like madness. Trump's tariff offensive has a clear purpose: to demonstrate who is dominant and who must submit. As a U.S. counterpart told me during the USMCA negotiations in 2018, we are 10 times bigger than you, so we should get our way 10 times more than you. The laughably flimsy, constantly changing justifications for the president's tariffs are in fact part of the point. True power is being able to do whatever you like for whatever reason you like, or for no reason at all. The rest of the world saw that too last week when tariffs were imposed on more than 80 countries on the grounds that they were violating forced labor provisions. This from a White House that's friendlier with China than it is with NATO allies. You don't need to have attended meetings in the Oval Office or have a degree in international relations to see that this is what's going on. The president has been his usual, utterly transparent self. Since Trump was elected a second time, he has repeatedly described Canada as the 51st state and our prime minister as a governor. The tariffs would not be levied, he has pointed out over and over again, if Canada were to absorb absorption. After the new measures were announced this month, Trump insisted that Canada was entirely at Washington's mercy. They need us to survive. Without us, there's no way they can survive. As Stephen Miller, one of Trump's top advisors, explained to CNN's Jake Tapper at the beginning of the year, we live in a world in which you can talk all you want about international niceties and everything else. But we live in a world, in the real world, Jake, that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power. In other words, this isn't about wine sales or how Canada manages its forests or reviving U.S. manufacturing. It's about whether Canada is prepared to accept a profound change in its relationship with the U.S. It's about whether Canada is willing to go from being an ally and a partner in a relationship governed by treaties and rules to being a vassal, subject to Washington's fiat, like the Venezuela of Delcy Rodriguez, only with snowdrifts and hockey. Nor is appeasement, which some Trump whisperers counsel, a way to avert that awful choice. Saying yes to the White House's demands just invites more of them until full submission has been established. Giving in gracefully is a less theatrical way of arriving at the same destination. Once you understand that, it's obvious how Canada needs to react. As we did in 2018 when we responded to the first major U.S. tariff attack with dollar-for-dollar retaliation, Canada must fight back. The only thing a bully understands is strength, and Trump is keen to establish himself as the world's apex predator. Self-defense works best when you do it as a team, and that is why my friend and former Liberal Party colleague, my former Liberal Party parliamentary colleague, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, has struck such a chord around the world with his call for middle powers to act together. That's the right thing for the rest of us to do. And it's happening faster than Americans may realize. But the big unknown remains what happens in the U.S. Trump has made his view plain. His Washington doesn't have allies. It has only satraps, enemies, and equals, the latter a singular group that includes just China and on some days, perhaps, Russia. That's what makes this fight such a critical test for the U.S. and Americans. The countries of the world, especially America's erstwhile allies, are watching U.S. politics almost closely as Americans themselves are. Inside the U.S., the pressing question is whether the country will remain a democracy. That matters to the rest of us too, of course. But even if democracy eventually prevails inside the U.S., America's old friends will wonder whether Trumpism permanently reshaped Washington's relationship with the rest of the world. Will a post-Trump America try to rebuild genuine partnerships with its like-minded allies based on the idea that win-win outcomes are possible and that even superpowers need to honor their treaty commitments? Or is Trump saying out loud what most Americans have really thought of their allies all along? The U.S. is understandably so preoccupied by its internal trauma and its war of choice in the Middle East that it's easy to imagine that these other foreign relationships are second-order questions. After all, in its 250th year, the Republic really is flirting with authoritarianism. But it would be a grave mistake for Americans to treat their place in the world as an afterthought, because the irony is that Washington is abusing its allies at precisely the moment when it needs them the most. As the war with Iran is demonstrating, even the U.S. is weaker when it goes alone. The U.S. will need friends even more if it hopes to hold its own against China. In 1944, when the U.S. began to construct the Pax Americana in earnest and to invest in the post war recovery of its allies, Washington accounted for close to half of the world's gross domestic product. Today, it is still the single biggest economy, but its share has fallen to just over a quarter. China's is roughly 17%. But add NATO partners along with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, and Team Democracy is back to well over half of the global economy, accounting for as much as 60%. Yet for a lot of its longtime members, that list of like-minded democracies doesn't feel like much of an alliance anymore. A Pew survey published this month showed that in most of the 36 surveyed countries, China was viewed more favorably than the US. That included Canada, where 33% saw America favorably, compared with 44% for China. People in France, Germany, and Britain took a similar view. At one level, that's nonsense. China has an authoritarian communist government that imprisons and executes dissidents and ethnic minorities and ruthlessly punishes foreign partners deemed to be stepping out of line, as it did with Canada a few years ago, imprisoning 2 innocent Canadians in response to our decision to honor our extradition treaty with the U.S. in an unrelated case. But given Trump's choice to play by China's rules and force smaller countries to suffer or to submit, the poll results shouldn't be much of a surprise. Superpowers, even the most benign, are always resented. That means that America's allies have all long harbored a latent strain of anti-Americanism. Those Pax Americana skeptics are gloating right now, wagging their fingers at the Atlanticists and saying they told us so. Would-be future American leaders who recognize the value of allies and think all will be forgiven when the White House has a new occupant need to appreciate the depth of the damage being done by its current resident. They can limit the harm and create the option for the U.S. to make a different choice in the future by speaking out now. If they don't, the rest of the world will be right to think that all Americans actually agree with the current bully in chief. The only winners from that outcome will be the world's despots. Or, as the great Canadian songwriter and poet Leonard Cohen presciently put it, you aren't going to like what comes after America. And here is an essay by Michelle Goldberg called A Setback for the MAGA Media Takeover. In April, the attorney Norm Eisen was on his way into the Supreme Court as part of the legal team fighting to preserve birthright citizenship when he got a text from the actor Mark Ruffalo. Along with several others in the entertainment industry, Ruffalo was searching for some way to stop the pending merger between Paramount and Warner Brothers, which would leave the MAGA suck-up David Ellison in charge of 2 of the big 5 major movie studios, as well as HBO Max and CNN. After acquiring Paramount, CBS's parent company, in 2025, Ellison delighted Trump by installing the anti-woke editor Barry Weiss atop the network, throwing 60 Minutes and other programs into crisis. Variety wrote that this rising empire skews alpha male, raising fears that he'd entwine the studio's content more closely with MAGA messaging. Ellison's willingness to cater to the president, he threw a party in Trump's honor in April, is almost certainly why Trump's Justice Department approved Ellison's bid for Warner Brothers, reportedly overruling career officials who worried that it would violate antitrust law. Should the merger go forward, many in Hollywood worried the new media behemoth would greenlight fewer TV shows and films, especially those that displeased Ellison's Republican allies. CNN might become an ersatz Fox News. Ruffalo said any kind of documentaries that are holding power to account will never make it to the marketplace. No one was quite sure how the consolidation could be thwarted. In Hollywood, said Ruffalo, the mood was both fatalist and opportunistic. When Trump stormed back into office, he seemed for a moment like a cultural as well as political conqueror, ushering in a much discussed vibe shift. When his corrupt Justice Department greenlit the merger, Ellison's success seemed inevitable. Besides, many in the industry were deeply wary of Warner Brothers' other suitor, Netflix, which they feared would put fewer movies in theaters. With Ellison about to become one of the most powerful men in movies, many seemed reluctant to cross him. Most of Hollywood, I hate to say it, they just laid down, said Ruffalo. And you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Eisen, a lawyer who's emerged as a sort of attorney general for the anti-Trump resistance, thought there was a path to stopping the merger and saw an imperative to try. Classically, one of the things that you see in a backsliding democracy is the autocrats' favored cronies seizing oligarchical control of the media, he said. That's how things had played out in Russia, Turkey, and Hungary. And now it seemed that the same dynamic was coming to America. What happened next, however, demonstrates the importance of not surrendering to authoritarianism prematurely. In a phone call on the Supreme Court steps, Eisen drafted an open letter denouncing the merger and celebrating reports that state attorneys general were scrutinizing it, tacitly encouraging them to take Paramount to court. Some leading Hollywood figures, including J.J. Abrams, Damon Lindelof, and Ben Stiller, signed on. A Times guest essay that Ruffalo helped write said, "Despite appearances, the end of this story hasn't been written." He was right. This month, buoyed by a growing movement, 12 Democratic attorneys general sued to stop Ellison's Warner Brothers takeover, arguing that it violated antitrust laws. Variety reported, historically, it's unusual for the states to take the lead on antitrust enforcement actions. But the case was strong enough that last week a California judge issued a temporary restraining order, putting the merger on hold. And on Friday, Paramount, which had hoped to close the deal this month, agreed to postpone the merger until next June, or the end of the trial, whichever comes first. The media reporter Oliver Darcy, founder of the influential newsletter Status, said of the delay, "I think it's seismic, and it certainly puts into question whether this deal will cross the finish line." Obviously, Ellison could still prevail, but at the very least, the delay is likely to cost him a lot of money. When Paramount was competing with Netflix to take over Warner Brothers, it sweetened its offer with a so-called ticking fee, in which Paramount agreed to pay Warner Brothers shareholders about $7 million a day if the deal isn't closed by September 30th. Should the deal drag on until next June, Paramount could be out almost $2 billion. The lawsuit could also put pressure on Paramount to settle, perhaps by spinning off CNN and making guarantees that would protect jobs in Hollywood. In an interview with Status, Rob Bonta, California's Attorney General, said it wouldn't be enough for Ellison to just give up control of CNN, but that such a move would definitely have value. The mere possibility that the deal could be defeated, said Ruffalo, has strengthened resistance in Hollywood. After Paramount announced its pause, SAG-AFTRA, the union that represents actors, broadcasters, and recording artists, finally voted to oppose the merger. There's a growing understanding, said Ruffalo, that if you let yourself be cowed by MAGA, you're doomed. If you fight, at least you have a fighting chance. And they're losing their grip on power. They're losing their grip on their narrative. As Trump looks ever less indomitable, so does his dream of remaking American culture in his image. That's the lesson for Eisen, too. That Trump is beatable if you take a page from his playbook and flood the zone with opposition. In Trump's second term, Eisen's 60-person outfit, called Democracy Defenders, has been involved in some of the most consequential legal battles against Trump, protecting birthright citizenship, ending Trump's weaponization slush fund, blocking the Justice Department's attempt to subpoena election officials in Georgia, and stripping Trump's name off the Kennedy Center. They're all about the defense of our democracy, said Eisen, and in some ways the Paramount Warner Brothers case is as important as any of them. And now another one. A historic shift is underway in Asia. This by Jennifer Kavanaugh. A historic shift has gathered pace across Asia this summer. Over the past several weeks, China has extended maritime patrols to cover Taiwan's east coast, demonstrating its ability to encircle the island. It has intensified military, trade, and diplomatic pressure on Japan and test fired a submarine launched ballistic missile that showcased its growing sea based nuclear capability. With an eye on China's growing power, other countries have drawn closer, revealing the contours of an emerging new security architecture. Japan has strengthened defense ties with Australia, the Philippines, and India, and it is discussing closer cooperation with South Korea. Japan has also scrapped its long-standing restrictions on defense exports and is moving to join South Korea as a regional arms supplier, while Australia has signed a new agreement with Pacific Island nations, including a mutual defense pact with Fiji. Since Trump's return to office, uncertainty over his commitment to the defense of Asia has sparked warnings that Beijing could seize the opportunity to be more assertive, pushing U.S. allies to band together. Those wheels are now turning, bringing new risks. Major changes in global security rarely unfold smoothly. Yet this doesn't have to mean that we are entering an era of instability for an economically dynamic part of the world that remains vital to U.S. strategic interests. An order in which Asian countries assume greater responsibility for their own defense and rely more on one another and less on an increasingly distracted U.S. could ultimately prove stable and secure. At any rate, it's unavoidable. An overextended U.S. is less prepared to underwrite Asia's security indefinitely than it once was. The war with Iran has exposed the limits of the U.S. military power and prompted Washington to divert military assets from other parts of the world, including the Asia Pacific region. And Trump has made clear that he wants U.S. allies to contribute more to their own defense. His administration has already announced significant reductions in the U.S. military presence and commitments in Europe. No comparable plans for Asia have emerged yet. A transition to a more self-reliant Asia must be managed carefully. If Beijing perceives a rapid weakening of American commitments or sees U.S. allies as newly vulnerable, it might conclude it has greater freedom to press its territorial and security ambitions, raising the specter of military confrontation. Fear of that possibility and of U.S. abandonment could quicken the arms race already gripping East Asia. China has steadily built its armed forces and expanded its nuclear arsenal. Japan has recently begun deploying longer-range missiles. South Koreans are debating whether their country should develop its own nuclear weapons. And Australia is investing in nuclear-powered submarines and missile capabilities. Alarming as those developments sound, history has shown that Asian countries with diverse interests and forms of government can build working partnerships without deep U.S. participation. The 11-member Association of Southeast Asian Nations, founded in 1967, is often criticized as slow and indecisive in responding to shared challenges and has done little to counter China's expansive territorial ambitions in the South China Sea. But ASEAN has helped to maintain peace among its members in a part of Asia previously torn by decades of war, and provided a framework for Southeast Asia to engage with China. A more balanced sharing of the security burden needn't weaken deterrence. Deeper cooperation between countries such as Japan, the Philippines, and Australia would actually strengthen the first line of defense against security threats, backed up by a gradually reduced yet still robust U.S. military presence. As U.S. allies become more capable and integrated, it is only fair that they shoulder more of the costs of their own protection, freeing up thinly stretched American forces to meet global security challenges elsewhere. The United States, for its part, could continue to coordinate closely with its Asia-Pacific allies, take the lead on tasks central to U.S. interests, such as keeping vital sea lanes open, and work to maintain stable relations with China. That kind of allied system would be stronger militarily, more durable over the long term than one that is over reliant on the US and able to act collectively if American assistance is delayed or unavailable. At any rate, the Middle East is proof that heavy American involvement is no guarantee that international rivalries won't explode into conflict. The U.S., along with Israel, started the war with Iran, exposing America's partners in the Persian Gulf to Iranian attacks and disrupting global trade. As a result, some Gulf states are rethinking their reliance on Washington and exploring ways to maintain their security through partnerships among themselves, which may even include Iran. The U.S. will remain a power in the Pacific, but the strategic balance has already shifted. American allies and rivals alike are wealthier and more capable than they were a generation ago, and U.S. forces are overstretched. Asia is adjusting to that new reality. And as we approach the opening of our local Costco, here's an article by Frank Bruni of Costco and Cliques. Costco is having a moment. I don't mean as a bazaar of bizarrely large quantities of walnuts, wheat thins, and teeth whitening toothpaste. I mean as a symbol, as a retort to what's wrong with America beyond its unvarnished walls. In The Atlantic in December, Jake Lundberg wrote an excellent tribute to Costco's efficiency and constancy. He said, quote, "In an age of broken institutions, insufferable politics, and billionaire businessmen auditioning to be Bond villains, most things feel like they're getting worse. Costco seems to stay the same." End quote. Adam Chandler evidently agrees. In the Wall Street Journal this month, he artfully cast Costco as a sorely needed point of consensus in an endlessly bickering country. The article's headline was "The One Thing Everyone in America Can Agree On? Costco." I don't know about everyone. I myself am a Costco fan. I get my eyeglasses as well as my canned tuna there. But I have some acquaintances who find it a depressing burlesque of American bounty, others who simply lack the closet space for a 6-month supply of toilet paper, and still others who've never been to Costco and don't care. The paeans to the store perhaps overstate its microcosmic significance and healing powers. But they're right that grocery shopping is as lucid a mirror of our moment as anything else. And what it really reflects is the fragmentation that Costco supposedly pushes back against. That's the rule to which Costco represents a bit of an exception. When it comes to groceries, as it does to clothes or cars or gyms or housing developments, we're the willing targets of ever more aggressive sorting and tiering. Different merchants target different groups with the promise to validate their particular tastes, accommodate their specific values, affirm their exact stations. Their marketing identity as much as they are poultry and peanut butter. They're creating tribes. I live on the border of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and Carrboro, North Carolina, where a suburban aura mingles with a college town vibe. When people around here announce themselves as regulars at the local Trader Joe's, they may be disclosing nothing more than their fondness for its steamed soup dumplings or its creamy spinach and artichoke dip. But at least as often, they're knowingly telling me how they see themselves and who they mean to be. Unfussy, but whimsical individuals whose fiscal prudence leaves room for inventive frozen canapes and exuberant checkout clerks. Their victual signaling? Victual signaling? I don't know what that is. So are some shoppers who swear by the Aldi that's just across the parking lot from Trader Joe's. Their choice isn't driven solely by Aldi's lower prices on many staples. It carries its own message. I'm immune to cutesy come-ons. I'm too practical for that colorful packaging and strenuous cheer over at Trader Joe's. And when local folks tout their pilgrimages to the Carrboro Farmers Market on Saturday mornings, they're sometimes revealing as much about their political leanings, concern for the environment, worry about sustainability, as their culinary ones. We are where we We are where we procure our legumes. And you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. It has always been thus, and we've always had options. But this many of them, each with painstakingly fashioned, carefully advertised brands, the combined population of Chapel Hill and Carborough is modest, at about 85,000. But that's apparently enough not only for the stores I've already mentioned, but also for a Whole Foods catering to the shopper interested in an especially robust cheese selection or just all-purpose pampering, a Fresh Market for the customer who's tempted by Whole Foods but wants to feel a little less like a luxury lemming or has sworn off all things Amazon, the corporate parent of Whole Foods. Two locations of the Weaver Street Market, a co-op that specializes in natural foods and has a clientele more tattooed and pierced than Fresh Markets, and a Wegmans for the proudly ambidextrous epicure who wants high-end halibut and low-end frozen breakfast sandwiches just a few aisles apart. That's not to mention the old-style alternatives of at least 4 Harris Teeter stores and 5 Food Lions, depending on how you count. How can you count Food Lions? If the denizens of Chapel Hill and Carborough can't agree on where to buy cereal, how can the voters of the U.S. come together on tax reform? I've been just once to Aldi, a tad too no nonsense for me, but I repeatedly visit all those other stores. I'm finicky about chicken thighs, best at Fresh Market, have more luck with the produce at Wegmans than at Trader Joe's, and use enough olive oil to warrant Costco's jugs of it, heavy as kettlebells. But I also tell myself that I'm refusing to be categorized and striking a blow for independent thought. I'm reaching across the supermarket aisle. Look at me and my heterodox dinner. Of course, that's its own identity, its own vanity. So where to head for the lamb I need for a dinner party I'm hosting in a few nights? Another interesting article, Stop Pathologizing Ordinary Life by Clay Rutledge, who is a research psychologist. Americans are more focused on mental health today than at any other point in our history. Public health campaigns urge us to check in on our feelings and talk openly about our struggles. Schools have adopted mental health curriculums. Employers often mental health days. There are thousands of mental health and wellness apps. Yet our mental health appears to be getting worse. Over the past several decades, the percentage of Americans who report being in poor mental health has been rising. Over half of U.S. doctors surveyed in 2023 reported a decline in their patients' mental health. That same year, more than 3/4 of companies reported rising mental health concerns among their workforces. Could our preoccupation with mental health be part of our problem? In some ways, encouraging people to think and talk more about their mental health is a good thing. There's now less stigma around mental illness, and more people who can benefit from professional help are getting it. But there's also reason to believe that efforts to bring attention to mental health struggles are inadvertently making us more vulnerable to psychological distress. Start with our expanding conception of mental illness. The more fixated we are on mental health, the more sensitive we become to anything that might qualify as a symptom, and the more we use clinical language to describe normal emotional experiences like grief, burnout, and loneliness. This broadening of what we think counts as a disorder, known as concept creep, encourages us to pathologize ordinary life and see ourselves as mentally unhealthy. Then there's our perception of how widespread mental illness is. By broadening what counts as a disorder, we begin to see it everywhere, including in ourselves. Research has found that when people view social media posts that normalize anxiety disorders, they become more inclined to think they have one. Nearly a third of American adults and half of Gen Z adults have given themselves a diagnosis of a mental illness based on information from social media. And research suggests that people who rely on social media for information about mental illnesses tend to have less accurate knowledge about them. But the problem isn't just that many people give themselves incorrect diagnoses. It's also that these misperceptions can put people on the path to developing poor mental health, a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. When people in one study were encouraged to adopt a broad view of what constitutes trauma, they reported greater levels of distress after watching a film clip with disturbing content and were more likely to describe the experience as personally traumatic. Or consider anxiety. A certain amount is useful. It helps keep us alert and motivated to reach our goals. But start viewing anxiety as a disorder and can become hypervigilant about avoiding anxiety provoking situations, which in turn can increase the risk of developing an actual anxiety disorder. None of this means we should abandon concern for mental health. It means we need a different approach, one that supports psychological well being without fixating on it. Fortunately, some of the most effective strategies for taking care of our mental health help get us out of our heads. Start with exercise. A growing body of research indicates that exercise does as good a job at reducing symptoms of anxiety and depression as psychotherapy or medication, and in some cases better. And exercise supports good mental health for everyone, those with and without mental health diagnoses. Activities such as volunteering and performing acts of kindness for others are also powerful ways to support mental health. One study randomly assigned individuals with anxiety and depression symptoms either to practice a set of cognitive behavioral therapeutic exercises or to engage in acts of kindness toward others. Both approaches reduced anxiety and depression, but the kindness group improved more, suggesting that focusing on someone else's problems took people's minds off their own worries. Which brings us to life's meaning. The more meaningful that people find their lives, the more resilient they are when facing stress, and the less at risk of depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and suicide. Finding meaning is often characterized as a contemplative exercise, something arrived at through deep deliberation. But while our ability to turn inward and ponder existential questions makes humans unique in our quest for meaning, finding meaning tends to involve outward-oriented action. That's because we feel the most meaningful when we are doing things that provide social significance, a sense that we matter, that we play an important role in other people's lives. We should be thankful for the progress we've made on mental health and continue to improve access to effective treatment. But we should also try to spend less time stuck in our heads and more time out in the world, pursuing the kinds of activities that support mental health without making us so obsessed with it. Are you a jerk or a sucker? That's the name of the next article. And it's by Robin Given. There isn't much love and there's definitely little sympathy for rich people right now, a fact that is entirely rich people's fault. You may be fretting over your health insurance premiums going up. They are optimizing their faces with $300,000 worth of microscopic tweaks and buying their way out of the indignities of flying commercial. Like many other people, I unreservedly disdain the billionaires who've taken a wrecking ball to our cultural and political institutions while giving up on the giving pledge. And just the mention of quiet luxury now makes me want to scream that there's nothing low-key about $1,000 slides from the row that are basically just zhuzhed down Birkenstocks. So perhaps that's why people have been conflicted about the show Your Friends and Neighbors. It's about rich people and is brilliantly acted with nuance and dark hilarity, but it arguably doesn't hit the one percenters viciously enough for the times. When the Apple TV series debuted in 2025, Emmy voters gave it a single nomination for its theme music. It didn't win. Online conversations continue to dissect why this exploration of an American class distinguished by landscaped estates, private jets, and families who pay list price tuition at Ivy League institutions is so unappealing. No small amount of that disdain is directed at the women who populate the show's fictional town of Westmont Village, a mashup of upmarket commuter towns in Westchester County with a hint of Greenwich, Connecticut, where everyone seems to be striving, competing, winning, and yet still feeling like a loser. This year, Emmy voters did better. While they failed to specifically acknowledge any of the actors, writers, or directors, they gave Your Friends and Neighbors a nomination for Best Drama, which it should win. For all its aspirational schadenfreude, it's really a humane homily for us all about the bumbling universality of trying just to be seen. Your Friends and Neighbors revolves around Andrew Cooper, known as Coop, who, played with chest-forward confidence by John Hamm, Coop, a discontented midlife version of the effortlessly seductive Don Draper, is conventionally handsome and has a body made for a business suit, a jock foundation with a soft outer layer formed by cocktail-soaked suburbia. Coop worked in hedge funds, where clients trusted him to make their money make more money, until a one-night stand with a junior employee doomed that career. His wealth lacks the patina of Gilded Age, the sweat stains of the Industrial Revolution, and the tech bros' blithe futurism. Coop didn't invent anything or improve anything. He's just well paid, and he lives among other very well paid people who spend their money in a competition to accumulate things. It's expensive being rich. You have to keep up. When Coop loses his job, he begins robbing those same friends and neighbors of watches, artwork, and baseball cards, and fencing the loot. For a time, Coop enjoys being a thief, the relative ease of it, the payoff, but also the sense that he's exacting a degree of revenge on the smug community he both loathes and admires. Coop is like so many of us, no matter our income. We're conflicted by the financial success of others. We always think we'd be better at being rich, more empathetic and philanthropic, better dressed and better behaved than the people who actually are. You think you wouldn't be a jerk until you realize being the only decent soul in a room full of rich jerks makes you feel like a sucker. Your Friends and Neighbors makes you wonder, does anybody actually earn outsized financial success? Can you be that rich and also be a good person? Are the only people putting faith in the American capitalist dream just creeps or chumps? That's not the most uplifting storyline, but it's a timely one. After all, we're living in the self-dealing era of the Epstein class, when the president of the U.S. made $2.2 billion last year, mostly through crypto schemes. During one of Coop's earliest capers, he slips into a neighbor's home and slides open a drawer containing a collection of watches, each of which fits the human wrist with about as much grace as a saucer strapped to a twig. In a voiceover, Coop offers a detailed description of the watch. The Patek Philippe Nautilus, sealed 18-karat white gold blue sunburst dial, water resistant up to 30 meters. He states these technical details in his flat tone, without any hint of the romance a salesman might inject to convince a customer that he deserves a high-performance watch to wear to his kid's soccer game. All anyone really needs to know is that the Nautilus retails for more than $70,000. It's valuable because it's expensive, and the right people know just how expensive. Coop may be stealing glitzy objects to maintain his socioeconomic standing, but he's also leveraging the audacity, desires, and insecurity of his neighbors to manage his own version of that toxic monster. That monster is in all of us. We don't turn into cat burglars, but plenty of us scour sample sales, vintage shops, and discount bins looking for certain brand name costumes to heighten the character we feel compelled to play in our own lives. We're all aspiring to a vision of the American Idol, one that gets ratcheted just out of reach with each step closer. Did you ever really arrive? Life's basic necessities are taken care of, but there are other worries. You're hoping that you've accurately defined happiness. You're hoping to be seen, to be acknowledged, to matter behind the dollar signs. To matter beyond the dollar signs associated with your name. Coop's ex-wife, Mel, played by Amanda Peet, spends much of season 2 wrestling with perimenopause. She is also in a fight with her neighbor, whose dog keeps pooping on her lawn. One drunken evening, she plots to push over construction workers' porta potty so it spills onto her neighbor's lawn, turning it into a gloppy blue swamp. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. I asked these people 50 million times to curb their dog. Keep your dog in your own yard. They ignored me time and again, she explains to Coop in a mix of anger and despair. They never took me seriously. They made me feel like I was nothing. Rarely have I seen such righteous existential rage expressed with such relatable vulnerability. Packed into her storm of emotions are big questions, petty ones, and simple observations, all of them rooted in the need to matter. Would Coop have been ignored by the neighbors if he'd made a similar request in his deep white man baritone? Would one of the 20-something models walking around like concubines at Mel's ex-boyfriend's housewarming be as invisible? And why wouldn't her neighbors hold up their end of the social contract? Your Friends and Neighbors, which has been renewed for a third season, doesn't ask us to feel sorry for the rich, nor does it throw gasoline on the roaring fire of hatred for them. And it's certainly no free-range anti-capitalist polemic like I Love Boosters. Its creator, Jonathan Tropper, told The Times, "We are skewering a value system, but at the same time we're making the show aspirational. We're still showing you the cars and the houses and the watches. It spends a good deal of time reminding viewers that money isn't a promise of happiness, though the series does acknowledge the sad truth that unhappiness is a lot easier to manage with financial privilege." Americans reflexively run toward money. Long after we've made enough to be comfortable, we keep running in search of respect, a reality made plain in season 2, episode devoted to the death of Coop's father. After the funeral, Coop finds a pair of Cartier cufflinks still in their original box that he'd given to his dad. Only a fool would give Cartier cufflinks to a man who regularly shopped the Brooks Brothers sale rack, Coop says in a voiceover. I doubt Ron Cooper even had a shirt that took cufflinks. But it was his birthday and I wanted to give him something nice, so I went with a pair of $4,800 designer cufflinks that he apparently never took out of the box. Like all gifts, this one said more about the giver than the recipient, Coop says, and I didn't love what it said about me. They reminded me much more modest, yet nice presents I gave my father. After he passed away, I went through his belongings and found a Thomas Pink shirt I'd given him that he'd never worn. It was folded neatly in one of his dresser drawers. The cufflinks I'd purchased to go with it were there too, tucked into the French cuffs. I suppose he liked the shirt. I know he kept it because it came from me. Your Friends and Neighbors asks, in the pursuit of the American dream, how do you avoid being a jerk or a sucker? We're so busy trying to make sure that who we are and what we've accomplished doesn't disappear from view. If we're really lucky, we've become people in our lives who see us clearly. If we're really lucky, we have people in our lives who see us clearly, not because of our successes, but despite them. And for those of you who like books, here is Booker Prize nominees include novels by Marlon James and Elizabeth Strout. This is by Alex Marshall. Marlon James's The Disappearers, the Jamaican writer's first non-fantasy novel since he won the 2015 Booker Prize for A Brief History of Seven Killings, is already one of this year's most anticipated literary releases. Now the novel about an anti-gay hate crime in 1980s Jamaica is likely to be even more so. On Thursday, it was nominated for the Booker Prize, along with a dozen other books, including fellow Booker winner Douglas Stewart's John of John and The Things We Never Say by the Pulitzer Prize-winning author Elizabeth Strout. The Booker, a distinguished British literary award, is given out each year to a title originally written in English and published in Britain or Ireland. The judging panel, led this year by the classicist Mary Beard, will announce a 6-book shortlist on September 22nd. The winner will be named at a ceremony in London on November 9th. Its author will receive £50,000, about $66,500. So here are the nominees. The Shadow of the Object by Chloe Aridjis. In this dreamlike tale, a woman who is hospitalized after being bitten by a dog must return a magic lantern to another patient's son. John Self, writing in the Financial Times, said that the book had an intense flavor that can only come from an author's deep investment in their material. That's The Shadow of an Object. The next one is Switzy by Emma Cline. Set for a September 8th release, Cline's third novel follows a retired business executive with a degenerative neurological disease as he visits friends and families before his medically assisted death in Zurich. That's Switzy. Helen of Nowhere by McKenna Goodman. The author's second novel centers on a professor who, after losing his job and partner, heads to the countryside where he hopes to live a bucolic existence he's not ready for. Joe Hamya in The Guardian called it a perfect fairy tale for our times. That's Helen of Nowhere. The End of Everything by M. John Harrison. A beachcomber pulls a mysterious being from the sand in this science fiction novel set in a coastal town. John Self in the Times of London said that Harrison has been writing confounding brilliant books for more than 50 years, and this was another one. That's The End of Everything. The Disappearers by Marlon James. James's latest, which is scheduled for a September 1st release, revolves around 8 men in 1980s Jamaica who respond to a casting call for a play with openly LGBTQ themes and are then met with bigotry and violence. That's The Disappearers. Black Bag by Luke Kennard. This eccentric, amusingly slanted campus novel, as described by Philip Womack in the Times Literary Supplement, reimagines an old academic experiment in which a man attends lectures covered in a black bag within contemporary academia. Okay, that's The Black Bag. The Renovation by Kenan Orhan. A Turkish exile living in Italy hires builders to remodel her bathroom and discovers that they've built a prison cell instead. M.J. Franklin in the New York Times said that learning its premise was sufficient to make him think, enough, I'm in. That's The Renovation. May We Feed the King by Rebecca Perry. Perry's novel begins with a curator transforming a former palace to make it look historically accurate, then darts hundreds of years backward into the world of a medieval king. Melissa Harrison in The Guardian called it a highly wrought puzzle box of a book. The Palm House by Gwendolyn Riley. Riley's latest book recounts the travails of an editor and a contributor to a highbrow magazine after a new executive arrives to shake it up. Christian Lawrenson in the New York Times described Riley as a novelist who's as thoroughly unsentimental as J.M. Coetzee or Michael Houellebecq. That's The Palm House. The Things We Never Say by Elizabeth Strout. A depressed high school history teacher discovers a long-hidden family secret in this story by an author who has been nominated for the Booker twice before, for O. William and My Name is Lucy Barton. Maggie Shipstead, writing in the New York Times, said this latest work rewards rereading. It's The Things We Never Say. John of John by Douglas Stewart. A gay man returns to his abusive father's farm on a Scottish island in the latest work by the author of Shuggie Bain. In the New York Times, Mark Harris called Stewart's latest work a moving, suspenseful, completely worth your time book. That's John of John. All Them Dogs by Jamel White. White's debut novel is about a Dublin gangster who flees from a feud and then tries to return to a life of crime 5 years later. Elizabeth Mannion in the Irish Times said the novel was beautifully audacious and filled with street lyricism. All Them Dogs. The Vivisectors by Missouri Williams. An academic befriends a student involved in a culture war controversy in this experimental novel. Ann Manoff in the New York Times said the novel promises a dangerous critique of contemporary sexual and cultural politics and a narrator who sympathizes with the collective enemy. Instead, it retreats into metaphor and meteorology. That's The Vivisectors. And that's the whole list, and that's it for today. This is Ted. I've been reading articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. As always, I hope you enjoyed it, found it helpful. I certainly enjoyed it, and I look forward to talking to you next week. Thank you for listening. Bye.